Hi everyone, so nice to see you virtually if not in person. In the depths of the lockdown in April and May, whenever we didn't have work events, we tried to organize night activities like in camp, and different family members would take responsibility for different night activities. One evening, our youngest, Livia, told us to dress in black tie and that the night activity was a surprise. And we came downstairs, she had set up a big screen, she had a projector, and it was the first annual Livia Awards, an Oscar-type award. And what was interesting to me was the awards were given not for sort of big moments, but for things like best attitude in coronavirus or funniest person in lockdown. Those were the awards. I was reflecting on the moments Livy chose to give awards to when I was looking at this week's Parsha. So this week's Parsha, Matot Masei, I was looking at Masei, and Masei it's quite boring. It's a travelogue. It's a list of places that Bnei Yisrael traveled to and from, and we're given no information about most places. Just vayasumi kivrot hatava vayachanu bechatzerot, like they just this is the place they went, and that's where they camped. I'll note that what is especially interesting to me at this moment in time is that they didn't really know how long they were going to be in any particular place. So part of what's interesting to me now, when we have no idea where we are in our own pandemic journey, is they were there sometimes for 2 years or more than 2 years, and sometimes for very short periods of time. So I'm quite empathizing with that. What's interesting is that there's a number of places where we're given very tiny bits of information about the places or what happened in the places where they went. And I want to note those places. And then for me, I think what I'm taking away from that is some sense of the Torah trying to hint to us about the psychological, the spiritual journey that Bnei Yisrael were on, along with this account of their physical journey as they approach the moment when they're ready to move on. So there's a couple of places where we're given a bit of information. After they crossed the Yam Suf, we're told they came to a place called Elim. And in Elim, there was 12 fountains and 70 palm trees. I'll note many of these places have to do with water, so I want you to sort of think about that, and we don't have time for it now. So they come to Elim, and Elim is clearly an oasis, probably a large, well-known oasis. The next place in Matot Masei where we're given a bit of information is called Refidim, and they came there, and the Torah tells us here in Masei, V'lo hayasha mayim lishtot. There was no water there to drink. We know the background story of that, which is Bnei Yisrael turn to Moshe and Aharon. It's very shortly after they've crossed through the Yam Suf, after they've seen those miracles, and they say, Hayim yesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayim. Is God even here? They have no water, and they just, even at this point, even having just crossed the sea, even having seen great miracles, they doubt that God even exists. My family will tell you my favorite midrash in the whole world has to do with figuring out how it was that Bnei Yisrael could have sinned in Chet HaEgel after they saw after they had seen the miracle of Yam Suf. And the midrash tells us, Rata shivchatal hayam ma shelo ra Yecheskel ben Buzi, that the most common person had visions the likes of which Yecheskel Hanavi did not have. But still, right, the point of that midrash is that big, huge moments don't change people. And we see that here. They were still quite spiritually immature. They couldn't even recognize the hands of God. In Oasis, they understood that, but they didn't recognize the hands of God here. The next place in Masei where we're given some information has to do with when they came 40 years later to Hor HaHar. So 40 years later, they come to Hor HaHar, and in Masei, we're given 2 bits of information. We're told that that is where Aaron passed away, and we're also told that that is where Melech Arad attacks them. So I want to sort of dig a little bit deeper into the story of Hor HaHar. 40 years in the desert. They are journeying. We know that their spiritual journey along this way has been very complicated around their relationship with their leaders, right? Chet HaEgel and asking Aharon to take part in that, and then Miraglim and Korach, right? A very complex relationship with their leaders. Shortly before Aaron dies, right, we are told that Miriam passes away and the Be'er Mayim disappears. the water that had sustained them disappears, and they turn to Moshe, and they're very, very upset, and they say to Moshe and Aharon, Lama havietem et hakahal hazeh lamut sham. Why did you bring us here to kill us, right? So they recognize that God is there maybe, but they are really looking at Moshe and Aharon as the intermediaries. Why did you bring us here? Why did you take us out in order to have us die here? And again, around water, there is a clash, but they are clearly looking to Moshe and Aharon. Following that story, Aharon passes away. And at this point in their spiritual development, they recognize that their leaders are moral. They are mortal. They are not demigods. They are not intermediaries. And so the psychological shift of having first not even recognized God, then seeing their leaders as sort of demigods or intermediaries, followed by a recognition, a 30-day mourning period in which they recognize the mortality of their leaders, I think moved to a spiritual development, an emotional shift, an emotional maturity. And the next moment we see them at is when they're attacked by Melech Arad. And at this point, Bnei Yisrael as a group turn directly to God. Vayidor Yisrael neder la Hashem in niton titin et ha'am hazeh biyadino. And it continues. Bnei Yisrael as a group turn to God and they make a neder, if you give us this nation in our hands, and so on. They take control of their own destiny. They try to think deeply about their relationship with God and what they need to take responsibility for. And I think what Parashat Masei is trying to tell us with this travelogue is they're trying to hint to the spiritual development and journey of Bnei Israel, their maturation, their ability to be people who take control of their own destiny, even when there are external forces that are fighting against that, and trying to move themselves forward in relationship with God without an intermediary. At this moment in time, we find ourselves in the middle of at least two journeys. The first really relates to where we find ourselves in the 3 weeks. We are at the moment when we are going to be descending more deeply into despair, right, as we move forward and into the 9 days, and really the moment when lack of civil engagement with fellow Jews, right, destroying each other's resources and so on and so forth, moves the people deeper into despair, ultimately in exile from the destruction of the temple, in exile from Jerusalem, and then actually the rebuilding, the creation of rabbinic Judaism disconnected from the temple, which is the Judaism we are living in now. At the same time, when Tisha B'Av is over, we begin the period of the Sheva Dinachemta, the 7 Haftarot that note for us the 7 weeks and the connection between that period of destruction and the movement towards hope and closeness to God. That period takes us through Nachamu into Elul, when we build our closer relationship with God, and ultimately into the Yamim Noraim. So where we're beginning this real journey that is a spiritual and emotional journey that is about our relationship with God. The second journey we're in the middle of is also where we are in the middle of the pandemic. Like Bnei Israel on their 40-year journey, we don't know if where we find ourselves is 2 years or 2 months or 2 days. And that is really very, very difficult and complicated to cope with. My blessing for us is that we are able to, although the external forces and maybe many of our leaders are not able to offer guidance, or we're not able to control them, right? Even despite that, we are able to say what are the pieces of ourselves that we can control, and how can we move ourselves forward to take control of those things, whether that's coming to Minyan or calling up someone or trying to connect or volunteer. Shabbat Shalom.